All right, welcome to the Explainer. Today, we're launching a full-scale historical investigation. We are looking closely at the chronological and archaeological evidence surrounding one of history's most famous, yet heavily debated figures, the Pharaoh of the Exodus. For decades, academics have argued over exactly who this ruler was, or if they even existed at all. But when we actually line up the ancient texts with the literal dirt of archaeology, a really fascinating profile emerges. Let's get into it. So, who really faced Moses? If you ask the average person on the street, or let's be honest, just turn on any Hollywood epic, pop culture points to one very famous name. They almost always cast Ramses the Great as the big bad. But when we look directly at the source materials, they present an incredible archaeological mystery that challenges that whole assumption. We've got to follow the evidence here, not the movies. Let's set up our primary suspects. The great debate among historians basically pits two main suspects against each other on our board. On one side, you have the late date theory. This anchors in the 13th century BC and naturally champions that widely assumed guy, Ramses II. On the flip side, we have the early date theory, rooted in the 15th century BC, which brings forth a very different candidate, Amenhotep II. To figure out who our real suspect is, we first have to figure out exactly when the event, the Exodus, actually took place. Okay, establishing the timeline. We're basing this squarely on the historical text itself. 1 Kings 6:1 gives us a very specific chronological marker. It states there were 480 years between the Exodus and the 4th year of King Solomon's reign, which is when he began building the temple. Now, historically speaking, Solomon's 4th year is really well established as 966 BC. Do the math, add 480 to 966, and you land our investigation directly in the year 1446 BC. That's our target date. To find our true suspect, we need a checklist, and we've derived a strict 4-point criteria directly from the biblical narrative. Number 1, he has to be ruling Egypt in our target year of 1446 BC. Number 2, his predecessor must have ruled for over 40 years. We know this because the text says Moses was hiding out in Midian for 40 years before the previous king died. Number 3, based on the 10th plague, the death of the firstborn, the Pharaoh himself cannot be a firstborn son or he would have perished. And number 4, by that exact same logic, his inheriting successor cannot be a firstborn son either. Let's bring our first suspect into the interrogation room, Ramses II. When we cross-examine him against our checklist, the verdict is absolutely brutal. He mathematically and historically fails every single requirement. Look at this. His reign didn't even start until 1279 BC. He's literally 167 years too late. His predecessor, Seti I, only ruled for 11 years, which totally fails the 40-year Midian requirement. And even if you try to make the math work by saying his successor Merneptah was the guy, Merneptah's successor, Seti II, was his firstborn son. It's just a complete failure across the board. Now, I know what some of you sharp investigators are thinking. If Ramses II fails so completely, why does Exodus 1:11 explicitly mention the Israelites building a store city named Ramesses? Well, scholars point out this isn't actually a contradiction. It was a super common practice for later scribes to update older location names, in this case the city of Avaris, so that contemporary readers in later centuries would understand the geography. They simply used the name that was familiar to them at the time. And this tension between the late and early dates is brilliantly illustrated right in the physical dirt. Up on Mount Ebal, archaeologists excavated a large, rectangular altar dated to around 1250 to 1200 BC, fitting the late date perfectly. But directly centered underneath it, positioned to honor and protect it, was a much smaller, older, round altar. By examining the pottery taken from that earlier altar stratum, researchers found materials that precede 1300 BC. This physically grounds the early date of 1446 BC in undeniable archaeology. Moving from the dirt to the documents, we have this incredible quote from antiquity. This is from the ancient Egyptian historian Manetho, writing back in the 3rd century BC. Manetho actually had access to early Egyptian records, and he explicitly writes that the people whose leader was called Moses took their journey from Egypt during the reign of Amenephis. Now, Amenephis is simply the Greek form of the Egyptian name Amenhotep. This ancient historian is literally naming our second suspect directly. So let's look at the chronological profile of Amenhotep II. This is where the puzzle pieces really start snapping into place. His predecessor and father, Thutmose III, had a famously long reign of 54 years. That perfectly satisfies the 40-plus year requirement from Moses' exile in Midian. And look at Amenhotep II's reign, 1450 to 1423 BC. It beautifully envelops our exact biblical target date of 1446 BC. But does he pass the biological test? Aligning with the devastating narrative of the 10th plague, historical and dynastic records confirm that Amenhotep II definitely passes. He was not the firstborn son of his father, Tutmos III. And, equally important, Amenhotep's successor, Tutmos IV, was not his firstborn son either. Everything fits exactly as the historical text demands. To add some tangible physical evidence to Amenhotep II's profile, we can look to the Nile Delta region. The 18th dynasty palace complex at Avaris was a place where Amenhotep II spent a lot of time. He was born there, he had estates there. Excavations show this palace was heavily occupied right through the reigns of Thutmose III and Amenhotep II. But then, right around our target time, it was suddenly and mysteriously abandoned. An entire royal complex just left totally empty. Okay, this is where it gets really crazy, like something straight out of a thriller. We actually have the physical body of our prime suspect. And when you look at the mummified remains of Amenhotep II, it uniquely features strange boil-like sores covering his body. Out of all the pharaohs found, his is the one that exhibits this specific pathology, chillingly echoing the plagues described in the text, specifically the plague of boils that broke out on the Egyptians. Now, hold on. I can almost hear some of you yelling at the screen. A critical investigator has to ask, wait a minute. If this is the guy, why do we even have his mummy? Doesn't the popular narrative say the Pharaoh of the Exodus drowned during the crossing of the sea? If he drowned, his body should be lost forever at the bottom of the water, right? Not resting comfortably in a royal sarcophagus. Well, interestingly, a really close reading of the text resolves this completely. Look at Exodus 14:23. It explicitly states that the Egyptians pursued them, and that all of Pharaoh's horses, his chariots, and his horsemen went into the midst of the sea. But notice what's missing. Nowhere does the text actually claim that the Pharaoh himself rode into the water and drowned. He sent his army in, they were swallowed up, but he survived to be buried in his tomb, sores and all. So what's the big takeaway here? When you strip away the Hollywood myths and look at the actual math, the dates, the ruins of Avaris, the ancient quotes from Manetho, and the physical mummy itself, the sources presents a highly compelling, evidence-based case for Amenhotep II. This explainer really shows how facts and physical archaeology can breathe life into ancient texts. Which leaves us with one final, fascinating question. If the historical details of this massive event align so perfectly with the dirt, what other ancient historical connections are just waiting to be uncovered in the sands of time?